welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. Today is Wednesday, which means I've got a book talk video for you guys. Today's actually going to be part one of two videos talking about my favorite used bookstore finds. Now, before I lived where I live now, about 4 years ago, I lived in Ontario in a fairly large-sized city. And they had one of the best used bookstores I have ever been inside. It was called Juniper Used and Rare Books, and it was run by a man who, in his own words, used to be a teacher, wasn't a very good one, and decided to just quit and follow his dream, which had always been to own a bookstore. And I used to love going in there because dealing with this man was so amazing. You could go in, casually mention a book that you were looking for. He'd help you find it or tell you that he didn't have it. And then you could go back a month or two later. Not only would he remember you, he would also remember the book that you had been looking for. And if he came across it in his searches for books, he would also have picked it up for you. And you really cannot beat service like that. Also, this bookstore was a house. It was an old house that was purchased, and every floor was filled with books. You went in and through the main door, and there was, kind of just the general fiction, and then the cash was there. But then you could go upstairs, and what used to be the kitchen was now filled with cookbooks and other food-related books. And then in what was probably once a child's bedroom and still had, he had put some, toys and decorations, was the children's books. And then just every room had a theme. And then up in the attic, he had all the kind of weird and wonderful science fiction books and things like that. And it was just so much fun to go from room to room and see what you would discover. And I've actually got a very interesting find that I'm going to talk about in the second video. That is perhaps one of the craziest things I've ever bought. And I can't wait to talk about that, but we're going to do that next time. So for now, let's just jump into what we've got for today. So the first book that I found is The Essays of Emerson. And this book is amazing. I first read this book in high school. I borrowed a copy from a friend of mine who was really into the book. And I remember I struggled a bit to get through this. Emerson is the master of the essay. He kind of makes it, the way that he writes them, he makes them almost a genre separate from just essay. The Emerson essay should be, its own genre of literature. And so I remember struggling with it a bit back when I first read it, but still it resonated with me in such a way that I kept seeking it out again and again to reread. And then one day I found this gorgeous volume in that bookstore. And I picked it up, and the pages are so thin and beautiful, and I just love this so much. It's a book that I constantly am picking up to reread. The essays are great to just read on their own. There's ones about nature and love and friendship and heroism. And Emerson was just such a wise man and such a gifted writer that you cannot go wrong with this. And I would definitely recommend picking it up if you ever get the chance to read it. Okay, next up we have this book, and it's called In Directions for Those Who Want to Write, and it's by Sydney Cox. This book is interesting. I picked it up mainly because, I write a lot, and I was very interested. I'm always interested in reading books by writers on writing. And I find there's usually a lot of wisdom in there and just a lot of interesting perspectives. So this one is kind of simply about the discoveries that writers make when practicing the craft. It's not, there's nothing incredibly life-altering in it, but it's just an interesting little book. It's small. It's not a It's not too much, but it's an interesting look at things, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it was a fun little find. I had never heard of it before. Most often the books that I pick up in used bookstores, especially like the older volumes, it's a repurchasing of a book that I already have in some form, but this was not, and I had never heard of it. But I quite enjoyed it. Next up is To Have and Have Not by Ernest Hemingway. If you have watched any number of these book talk videos, you know that I am a huge Hemingway fan. I am absolutely in love with the style, the minimalistic style of writing, the, just that classic Hemingway. You can pick a paragraph from a bowl and read it, and you know when you're reading Hemingway. And I love that. This is a story of a man named Henry who's a good, honest man whose family is in shambles, and he needs to find a way to keep them from completely falling apart and keep them financially afloat. And so he is kind of forced into running contraband from Cuba to Florida, or in between Cuba and Florida. And I love when Hemingway writes about Cuba because he had a long-standing love affair with that country. And I love when he writes about Paris, and I love when he writes about Cuba. Those are the two places that you can tell really owned his heart. And this is a great story, in my opinion. It's violent. If you are, if you don't like reading things with violence, this is definitely not the book for you. And it is certainly not where I would suggest starting with Hemingway. It's not his best, nor his easiest to read. I always suggest A Movable Feast if you want to begin with Hemingway. But if you are already familiar and don't mind a bit of violence, To Have and Have Not is lovely. And I love the color of this volume. So pretty. I love the signature on the front. This was an easy decision to purchase when I came across it. And finally, for today, is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is an older copy. What really drew me to this, okay, first of all, The Bell Jar, I avoided this book for years because, you hear so much about it and you get a little nervous about reading it yourself, and it seemed too cliched to, in college or high school be reading The Bell Jar, so I avoided it. It wasn't until later that I picked it up. And this copy is an older one from, I think, the 60s. It is in disarray. It's falling apart. But what made me pick this up is throughout the book, there are lots of markings and notes that the previous owner had put in there, and I love that. I love being able to see what meant things to somebody else to the point that they were compelled to underline it or make a note by it. So I'm not going to talk too much about the contents of The Bell Jar because I feel like we all, if you're interested in reading and whatnot and watching this video, you've probably either read it or heard about it. But it's, it's a classic, widely read tale of a woman falling into the grips of insanity for probably the last time. And it's very stark, it's very depressing, and it's a tale basically of alienation, like just total alienation from everything, from yourself, the world, society, just alienation. It's very sad, but I liked the personality inside this volume. So there you have it. That's part one of my favorite used bookstore finds. I can't wait for part two to talk about one of the strangest things I've ever found in a used bookstore, and it includes a bit more of the story about the owner of the bookstore that I was talking about at the beginning of this video. One final thing before I go, I'm very happy to say my copy of The Fireman by Joe Hill finally arrived. So I'm just now finishing up another book, and then I'm going to dive into this one. It's pretty big. And then I will be doing a dedicated review to this book, and I can't wait. So until then, I hope you're having a great week, you guys. I hope that you are enjoying the first days of summer and that everything is great. And I will see you guys again on Friday. Bye.